the Louisiana Purchase and Westward expansion. How 1803 shaped America's rise as a global power. But forget the geography for a moment. Forget the maps in your high school textbook that showed America doubling in size overnight. The real story nobody talks about is this. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't about land at all. It was about control of something far more dangerous: money, power, and the ability to bankrupt a European empire. And by the time Americans realized what they'd actually bought, they had already set in motion a continental conquest that would cost tens of thousands of lives and reshape the very meaning of what a nation could become. Stay with me, because at the end of this video, I'll show you the one decision made in 1803 that nobody actually intended, and how it built the foundation for America's rise in ways that had nothing to do with geography. If you've watched Cold War Clarity before, you know we focus on the post-1945 era, but this video goes backward deliberately, because understanding the Cold War means understanding how America got to be the global superpower that could afford to compete with the Soviet Union. And that story begins not with military might, but with a financial gamble in Napoleon's court. Subscribe now if you want to trace how American power actually built itself, piece by piece, decade by decade. And I'd love to hear in the comments, did anyone in your family live through any part of this expansion as it was happening? Your ancestor stories matter here. Hold on, this part is critical, and I need to make sure you catch it. If you want to understand the mechanisms behind how territorial expansion actually fueled economic dominance, not just politically, but in ways that shaped American capitalism itself, our complete guide on this era is available in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. That guide walks through the financial architecture that made expansion possible, the kind of detail that transforms how you read American history forward. It's there if you want the full picture. Here's what happened. In 1803, France owned the Louisiana Territory. It was massive, roughly 828.0000 square miles, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. But France didn't control it for strategic reasons. France controlled it because Napoleon needed money. He'd been fighting wars across Europe, and he'd lost his crown jewel colony in Haiti to a slave rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture. Without Haiti's sugar wealth, without a secure foothold in North America, Napoleon's grand design for a French empire in the New World had collapsed. So in 1803, Napoleon made a decision that should have meant nothing to the young American Republic. He offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. To put that in perspective, that was roughly 2 to 3% of America's entire gross domestic product at the time. It was staggering. Thomas Jefferson sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to Paris to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans, just the port city. They came back with a contract for the entire continent west of the Mississippi. Jefferson never asked Congress first. He never polled the nation. He saw the opportunity, and he took it. And here's the thing that keeps getting sanitized in the textbooks. Jefferson himself wasn't entirely sure what he'd bought. The American government didn't have accurate maps. Nobody knew how far the territory stretched. Nobody had surveyed it. Nobody understood what resources it contained. Jefferson authorized the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 to find out. 2 army officers, an enslaved man named York and a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, set out to map the territory, to understand it, to mark it as American. That expedition took 2.5 years. It cost lives. It revealed mountains, rivers, and indigenous nations that no American had imagined. But the expedition was never the real story. The purchase itself, that financial transaction in Paris, was the pivot point. America went from a nation clinging to the eastern seaboard to a continental power overnight. And the remarkable part is that it happened almost by accident. The purchase created an immediate problem. What do you do with land you don't control, can't fully map, and don't actually own in any legal sense? The indigenous peoples who lived there, the Sioux, the Mandans, the Blackfeet, the Crows, dozens of nations, had no idea they'd just been sold to a foreign government. They had treaties with French traders, they had established economies, they had homes. American settlement didn't happen gradually. It exploded. Once the door opened, hundreds of thousands of people moved west. Farmers, speculators, slaveholders looking for new cotton land. By 1820, Missouri had applied for statehood. By 1840, settlement had reached the Great Plains. By 1849, the gold rush in California had drawn hundreds of thousands more, and each wave of expansion collided with indigenous populations in ways that were catastrophic. But here's where the geography obscures the actual power story. Jefferson bought the territory, thinking it would take 200 years for American settlers to reach the Mississippi. He thought he was securing America's future in a distant, almost theoretical sense. Instead, he'd triggered a cascade of events that would reshape the continent in a single generation. And those events, Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, the conflicts over slavery in new territories, the Mexican War, all of those erupted from that one decision made in a Paris parlor in 1803. The purchase didn't just change geography, it changed what American power meant. For the first time, the nation could imagine itself as a continental presence, and continental power, as we'll see in the next section, required an entirely different kind of government, military, and economic infrastructure. The logistics alone were staggering. Jefferson had purchased roughly 828.0000000 square miles, land he'd never seen, populated by indigenous nations, whose sovereignty he'd erased with a signature. The federal government now owned a territory larger than the original 13 states combined, but ownership and control were entirely different matters. Within months, Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition to map what he'd bought. 2 years, 4.00 miles, 33 men, 1 woman, Sacagawea, and her infant son traveled up the Missouri River and across the Continental Divide to the Pacific. They returned with specimens, journals, geographic data, and something more valuable, proof that the continent was exploitable. There were beaver furs, there were potential trade routes, there was land that could be cleared, planted, and settled. What Jefferson had purchased was not empty land awaiting American civilization. It was home to the Sioux, the Mandan, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, and dozens of other nations with millennia of accumulated knowledge about how to survive and thrive in those environments. From the American perspective of 1803, those people were obstacles. They owned nothing in the legal sense. They had no government that white Americans recognized, and so they had no rights that the Purchase recognized. This is where the cruelty embedded in the Louisiana Purchase becomes undeniable. The expansion wasn't a peaceful spread of settlement. It required the systematic dispossession of every indigenous nation between the Mississippi and the Pacific. That process took decades and cost thousands of lives, native and settler both. By 1830, President Andrew Jackson formalized the machinery of removal. The Indian Removal Act authorized the federal government to force march indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands in the southeast to designated territories west of the Mississippi, the very lands that had just been purchased. The Cherokees, Creeks, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole were given a choice: leave voluntarily or be removed by force. Most chose the former only because the latter was worse. The Cherokee removal in 1838 became known as the Trail of Tears. Around 4.000 key died on that march, of disease, starvation, and exposure, along a 1,000-mile forced migration. Entire families were separated. Children were torn from mothers. The elderly were left behind when they couldn't keep pace. American soldiers enforced the journey with rifles and whips. Hold on, I need you to understand something foundational about what we're discussing here. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't simply a real estate transaction. It was the mechanism that converted American territorial ambition into legal fact. Once Jefferson owned that land, even if ownership meant nothing to the millions already living there, the government could justify removal, seizure, and settlement as the lawful exercise of property rights. That logic cascaded from Jefferson's Paris deal all the way to the Trail of Tears and beyond. Your deepest understanding of how the Louisiana Purchase shaped America, the patterns that created the nation we recognize today, those are explored in the complete guide available in the description below and pinned to this channel. The guide walks through the mechanisms of territorial acquisition, the breakdown of indigenous sovereignty, and how legal ownership became the justification for centuries of displacement and conflict. It's the foundation beneath every Western expansion narrative that follows. Settlement accelerated after the 1830s. Wagon trains moved westward in increasing numbers. New territories filled with American settlers hungry for land, resources, and opportunity. By 1848, the United States had fought and won a war against Mexico, acquiring California, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. The continental expansion that Jefferson initiated was nearly complete. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, the nation stretched unbroken. But that expansion created a new problem that Jefferson hadn't anticipated and couldn't have solved in 1803. All that new territory raised a brutal question. Would slavery exist in the new states and territories? This is the collision Jefferson created but never addressed. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the nation's size. Westward expansion had filled it with settlers. Now Congress faced a question without a precedent. How would America govern slavery across territories it had just claimed? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted an answer. North and South agreed to draw a line. Everything above it would be free. Everything below would permit slavery. It was not a solution. It was a delay. And delays, when the underlying issue is existential, only make the final reckoning worse. Frankly, this is the part that still gets to me. Jefferson died in 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. He never saw what his purchase unleashed. The compromise that bore his contemporaries' fingerprints, Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise, bought peace for one generation, but it fragmented the nation's conscience. Northern states industrializing, needing free labor and wage workers, southern states deepening their dependence on enslaved people and plantation agriculture. Two economic systems, two moral frameworks, both now competing for control of the same expanding territory. The Louisiana Purchase had created the space for that competition. Geography alone doesn't start wars. Competition for geography does. By 1850, another compromise was needed. The Compromise of 1850 added more lines, more conditions, more promises that each side couldn't keep. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 abandoned the line altogether, letting settlers themselves decide whether a territory would permit slavery. That decision sparked violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded Kansas, fighting for control. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas. Americans were now killing Americans over the question Jefferson's Purchase had placed on the map: who owns the land, and what labor system builds the nation that owns it? The expansion didn't end. California joined the Union in 1850, tipping the balance toward free states. 12 years later, the election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed slavery's expansion into new territories, triggered Southern secession. The Civil War began in 1861, fought ultimately over the same fundamental tension the Louisiana Purchase had created 60 years earlier. Could one nation permanently contain two incompatible labor systems competing for the same continent? Hold on. I need to mark something clearly here. This video moves fast, and this is the hinge point where Jefferson's real legacy becomes visible. The guide I mentioned earlier, the comprehensive guide to this era, it lives in the description and is pinned to this channel. It covers the full machinery of how territorial expansion became racial policy, how the Constitution's compromises on slavery were weaponized, and exactly how the Purchase's geography made civil war inevitable by 1861. Understanding that mechanism changes how you read American history forward from here. The Purchase gave America the land. Westward expansion gave America the settlers. But the expansion also gave America a question it couldn't answer peacefully. How would slavery fit into a continental nation? Jefferson's Purchase didn't cause the Civil War. It created the condition for it. The war cost 620,000 American lives. More Americans died in that conflict than in all other American wars combined until Vietnam. All of those deaths trace backward to 1803, to the moment Jefferson authorized the Purchase and set westward expansion in motion without resolving the moral and economic contradictions it would create. The nation was reunited by 1865. Slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment, but the land question, the original question, never truly resolved. What happened to the enslaved people after emancipation? How would they claim a stake in the continent that had been built on their labor? Those questions drove another 100 years of conflict: Reconstruction, Jim Crow, segregation, civil rights. The Louisiana Purchase set in motion a westward movement that required slavery to fuel it, created a continental nation that slavery then fractured, and left unresolved the fundamental question of who belonged on that continent and on what terms. By 1870, the question of Western land had split into two separate catastrophes. One was political, the other was personal, affecting millions who had no voice in Congress. The Homestead Act of 1862, passed during the Civil War, promised 160 acres of Western land to any settler willing to farm it for 5 years. It was generous. It was also almost entirely white. When freedmen tried to claim land in the South or West, they faced violence, legal obstacles, and outright theft. In 1875, a freedman named Menard tried to homestead in Kansas. His neighbors burned him out. The federal government, distracted by Reconstruction politics and the demands of railroad companies, did little. Railroad companies received even more land than individual settlers. 75 million acres went to railroads between 1850 and 1900. The logic was simple. The railroads would connect the continent, so the government gave them the continent. Investors in Boston and New York got rich. Native peoples got displaced. Freed people got shut out. The wealth generated by that western land flowed eastward, into industrial capital. This is where the threads of 1803 become visible in 1900. The Purchase created a continent. Slavery and genocide populated it. Reconstruction failed to redistribute it. Capital concentrated it. By the turn of the century, a small number of railroad magnates and land speculators controlled more Western territory than most European nations. The question Jefferson had imagined, an endless, egalitarian republic of small farmers, had become a concentrated empire of monopolies. Hold on for a moment. I need to bring something important into focus here. The full mechanism of how the Louisiana Purchase transformed into an industrial empire, how geography became concentrated wealth, how westward expansion became monopoly capital. That's what the detailed guide in the description explores in complete depth. It traces the financial instruments, the legal loopholes, the political compromises that turned public land into private fortunes. If you wanted to understand not just what happened, but how it actually happened, the guide unpacks that machinery. It's in the description and pinned comment. By 1900, the era of free Western land was essentially over. The frontier, in the historical sense, had closed. The Census Bureau officially declared it in 1890. What this meant was significant. There was no longer a margin of unclaimed territory where the dispossessed could start over. Every acre had an owner. Every opportunity required capital. This changed how Americans understood their national identity. For 70 years, the West had represented possibility. A man without means could go west and claim a future. That narrative had been a lie for most people, but it had been a powerful lie. It had justified westward expansion. It had convinced millions that America was fundamentally different from Europe, a place without fixed class hierarchies, without landed aristocracies, without limits. When that margin disappeared, Americans had to confront what they actually were: an industrial power, an urban nation, a place where wealth concentrated, a place where opportunity required existing money. The psychological shift was real and disorienting. Populist movements erupted in the 1890s. Progressive reformers demanded trust-busting and regulation. Labor movements turned violent. None of this was accidental. All of it flowed from the same source, the closing of the frontier, which revealed the reality that westward expansion had always masked. The Louisiana Purchase had purchased not just land, it had purchased time. It had given America 70 years to industrialize behind the mask of frontier possibility. When that time ran out, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. Theodore Roosevelt understood this. He had lived on the frontier as a young man. He had seen the open space vanish. And when he became president in 1901, he grasped what most of his contemporaries were only beginning to sense. America could no longer expand westward, so it would have to expand outward, overseas. This was the pivot, not a sudden turn, but an inevitable one. The closing of the frontier didn't cause American imperialism directly. It created the psychological and economic conditions that made imperialism feel necessary. A nation that had always solved its internal tensions by pushing west now had to find another outlet. That outlet became the Caribbean, the Pacific, the world. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was the first expression of this pivot. Quick, decisive, victorious. America acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and effectively took control of Cuba. The Philippines came next, not as a colony exactly, but as an occupied territory under American military administration. These weren't settler colonies, they were strategic possessions, coaling stations, markets, stepping stones to China and Asian trade. This mattered for one specific reason that still echoes today. When America expanded west, it expanded as settlers. Farmers, ranchers, families moving with the intention to stay, to build, to make the land their own. That was the mythology anyway. It created a kind of democratic feeling about expansion, even as it displaced native peoples. The new imperialism was different. It was corporate, military, administrative. It didn't require settlers. It required investment, naval bases, and trade agreements. The frontier mentality, the belief that a restless nation could solve its problems through movement and acquisition, persisted. But the mechanism changed. Instead of wagon trains and homesteads, there were battleships and business contracts. Before we continue, keep this particular mechanism in your mind for a moment. The way a nation that has exhausted one frontier must create or find another. The way that impulse stays constant, even as its form changes. This pattern repeats throughout history, and understanding it unlocks why empires rise and why they eventually stumble. Our in-depth guide on this era, available in the description and the pinned comment, walks through the economic signals and geopolitical patterns that actually predict imperial expansion. It's not about what leaders say they want, it's about what structural conditions force them to do. The guide breaks that down completely. The mechanics were straightforward. American industrial capacity had exploded. Factories produced more goods than the domestic market could absorb. Overseas markets offered a release valve, but overseas markets meant overseas presence, naval presence. Political influence. This wasn't ideology in the romantic sense, it was mathematics. Surplus production required new markets. New markets required protection. Protection required military and political control. Presidents from McKinley through Taft understood this perfectly. They used American naval power to pry open Chinese ports. They imposed tariffs to protect American manufacturers. They negotiated trade agreements that favored American corporations. They intervened in Central America and the Caribbean repeatedly, sometimes openly, sometimes covertly, to secure American economic interests. Nicaragua, Honduras, Mexico, Dominican Republic. The pattern was consistent. This was where westward expansion actually led. Not to a final limit and then peaceful settlement, but to a redirection of the same restless impulse outward into the world system. America had run out of West. So America became the nation that refused to accept limits anywhere. And this is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't simply about land. It was America's first statement: we will expand until we cannot expand anymore. Then we will find another way to expand. The Act of 1803 didn't end westward movement, it weaponized it. It created a national psychology so bound to growth, so dependent on the frontier as a release valve for ambition and surplus and restlessness, that when the geographic frontier closed in 1890, America didn't become a normal nation. It became something far more consequential, a nation that had trained itself over 90 years to see expansion not as a choice but as a necessity. The Louisiana Purchase gave Jefferson a vast territory, but it gave America something deeper, a template, a proof that the world could be moved, redrawn, reorganized according to American will and American capital. $12 million in 1803 became the Colorado Territory, the Great Plains, the Pacific Northwest. That arithmetic, that a small expenditure now yielded enormous territorial returns, it never left the American imagination. By 1900, American policymakers weren't buying land anymore. They were buying influence. They were buying markets. They were buying the right to say which governments lived and which fell. And they were doing it with the exact same logic that drove Jefferson's negotiators to Paris. You pay now, you expand your power now, and the returns compound across generations. This is what made the 20th century American. Not some unique moral superiority, not democracy spreading naturally across the globe, but the collision between an empire in formation and a world system that was still being written. America had the capital, America had the navy, America had the hunger, and America had inherited from that single purchase in 1803 a national culture that treated expansion as normal, necessary, and perpetual. The Louisiana Purchase shaped America's rise not because it added land. It shaped America's rise because it showed Americans what they could do if they believed hard enough and had enough money and enough conviction that the world belonged to them. Everything that followed, the Civil War, Reconstruction, industrialization, the Spanish-American War, the interventions in Latin America, the open-door policy in China, all of it was the Louisiana Purchase thinking applied to a larger stage. When Americans say we are a nation of expansion, a nation of growth, a nation that believes in perpetual increase, that belief didn't come from the national character. It came from having done it once, early, and catastrophically successfully. We bought a continent, we filled it, we industrialized it. Then we looked outward and we did it again. That's the inheritance, not just of wealth or territory, but of a way of seeing the world. An assumption that America's role was to grow, that limits were temporary, that the world would bend to American interests because American interests were, by definition, larger than anyone else's. The tragedy and the truth live in that same fact. The Louisiana Purchase was neither a sin nor a salvation. It was a transaction that worked, so completely, so thoroughly, that it rewired how Americans thought about their own possibilities. We still think that way. We still believe growth is inevitable. We still struggle when told there might be limits. We still see the world as something that can be negotiated with, bought from, or reorganized according to our needs. That impulse didn't die in 1945 or 1989 or 2001. It's still alive. In our trade policies, in our military presence worldwide, in how we talk about American exceptionalism, in how we approach problems that don't have a frontier solution, but we keep searching for one anyway. This week, take time to notice where you see this thinking in your own life. Not in history books, but in the news cycle, in political debates, in how American businesses operate overseas, in assumptions you may not have questioned. The Louisiana Purchase was one transaction in 1803, but it made certain assumptions about American possibility permanent. That's worth thinking about, really thinking about. Thank you for staying with this history. If you want the full, detailed breakdown of how the Louisiana Purchase's economics, diplomacy, and geopolitics created the American empire that shaped 2 centuries of world affairs, the complete guide is available in the description and pinned to the top comment. Subscribe to Cold War Clarity, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss when we unpack the next chapter of the world that shaped us all.